Hi, and welcome to this week's Thrive in 5. This week I want to talk to you about how to make good decisions. And I think as we live in business, as we run businesses, as we live in our day-to-day lives, decisions are always showing up for us. And in some instances, they're incremental, small decisions that just we have to make on the fly, and the outcomes of those decisions are not that big. But as decisions get larger, then I think it's more appropriate to actually think these through. And so what I want to just express to you a little bit today is how to help yourself make better decisions, especially as those decisions get larger. And these are generally decisions that are made internally by you, and often, even if they're big, often show up for you on a regular basis. And I want to help you make good ones. I think one of the first ways to ensure that you make good decisions is recognize why you make bad ones. And there are three things that I think are important that drive making bad decisions. The first one's anchoring. And anchoring is a psychological reference point that basically says the information that you get first is often the one you go with. So if you understand and know that decisions sometimes come because that's the first amount of information or that's the first source of information you got, be wary of that because we are prone to anchor based on the first thing that we experience or the first set of information we get. The second one is status quo. We can make bad decisions for ourselves based on what everyone's doing. Because everyone is doing does not mean that it's the right thing for you to do. And in many cases, the way we look at the status quo is often through the lens of feeling like we belong as opposed to deciding what's right for us. So bad decisions come oftentimes from just following the status quo. This one to me is really, really valuable to be aware of, and why we make bad decisions is often because of something called subjective confirmation. So what we do is we subjectively look for all the evidence that supports our desire instead, and that's often subjective, instead of looking for opposing sources. So all we do is go find the evidence that supports what we're trying to accomplish or the decision we're trying to make. And so we're biased that way. And when any of these show up, and there's more, but those are three that I wanted you to be aware of. If any of those show up, then you're likely to make a worse decision than you could if you move over to the kind of good decisions that I want to encourage you to make. So good decisions come from really understanding three elements. Gut is one way people make decisions. They trust their gut or their instinct. And gut is very important, but if you make your decisions on gut alone, you're going to hit walls, especially as they get bigger, because you've got to recognize that you've got these bad decision mechanisms working in your life. So your gut instinct can be flawed, especially as you get into bigger and bigger decisions. So really what you have to employ is gut and logic. And logic is really assessing the thing from information. What are all the aspects of the decision that you have to make? And so logically assessing that. So taking, not necessarily removing the gut, but adding logic, adding questions, digging into financials on it, digging into implications. And so logic is really important. But I'm going to suggest that even beyond those, because a lot of people live just in gut and logic. And I think it's appropriate when you make a decision to employ both. It's really important to have both in play. But the third one for decisions is get evidence. And this is one we often miss in the moving towards good decisions. So we might be predisposed to look at a product that was offered us, and we see all of the things we tend to be looking for from a subjective confirmation. Our gut's working for us, and the way it's been presented provides a lot of logic, but we miss the evidence that's very easy to find in today's world. So for example, as you know, we run a web marketing company called Web Vitality, and one of the things that happens on a regular basis is we hear that people have made decisions about employing a particular technique or employing a particular vendor to support them. And yet the evidence is pretty clear when you just go digging a little bit for it that it's flawed. It's a bad decision. in say search engine optimization, there's old ways of doing things and there's up-to-date ways of doing things, and often what we hear is people have gone and done things that are actually old ways of doing things. They've hired a company to do something that doesn't work anymore, and it's clear, there's clear evidence out there with just a little bit of digging to find that. I think the next thing to add to this whole sense of evidence, so gut, logic, evidence, but the other thing that you have to ask yourself is, if I employ this decision, what's the worst that can happen and what's the best that can happen? I think you have to be prepared to accept the worst if you make this decision, and you have to look at what are the optimal outcomes. But what's interesting is, from a subjective confirmation, we often only look at best outcomes. We don't ever consider the worst outcomes. And so it's really important when you're making bigger and bigger decisions, what's the risk that you're taking with this decision and what could possibly go wrong? And one of the few ways to get to that is to rely on experts. And within the question often is, and it's a question I ask, it's a question I ask my team, it's a question I ask my mastermind group, it's a question I ask my advisors, which is, when I'm making big decisions, I'll often go to them and say, what's your perspective on this? Because without that support, you often miss things completely, and you miss what's the worst that can happen. You miss some of the logic or evidence that they might have. And so when you think about making good decisions, understand gut, logic, evidence, best and worst case scenarios, and employment of experts to help make sure that the right thing happens. But as we conclude, I want to remind you that the decision itself will never create an impact in your business as much as how you handle the consequences of that decision. Decisions are required on an ongoing basis. You just have to make decisions. You can't live stuck all the time. So decisions have to come. But it's not always the decision that's the issue, and it's not always the decision. It's how you handle the consequences of the decision you make that ultimately affect whether it was a good decision or not. I hope that helps. We'll talk to you soon.